All right, so we'll talk about chapter 25, which is bleeding. So the big thing with bleeding is you need to manage the airway first. Airway always comes first. So ABC. So airway breathing can be relatively simultaneously. C is just recognizing that bleeding and making sure that you know how it's going to affect the body. Is this something that's life-threatening? Is this something that we can take care of later? Bleeding can either be external or it can be very obvious, or it can be internal and be very hidden. Now, sometimes internal bleeding is pretty obvious, but if it hits that point, typically it's a fair amount of bleeding, unfortunately. Either type can be very dangerous, can potentially cause weakness, shock, or death, and uncontrolled bleeding is the most common cause of shock after some sort of traumatic event. So your cardiovascular system, we did talk about it a little bit. It circulates the blood to all of your cells and tissues in order to deliver oxygen and nutrients, to take away waste products. It's responsible for supplying and maintaining adequate blood flow, amongst other things. There are three main parts. You have the pump, you have the container, and the fluid, which I call the contents when I'm teaching this. So the heart is the pump, the blood vessels are your container, and the contents is your blood and your body fluids that are actually contained within the cardiovascular system. It is meant to be a closed system, so it's not supposed to go anywhere outside of the circulatory system. Yes, stuff does transition between the cells, and you can put a little bit of fluid in between the cells into the interstitial space, but for the most part, it's supposed to stay where it's at. The heart does not actually absorb any blood from the inside. It has its own blood supply that comes off of that aorta, the really, really big artery that's annotated in red there. But it has to have a really good blood supply because your heart needs a lot of oxygen. It's very muscular. It does a lot of work. So it has to have all of that oxygen to do that. And it works as two separate pumps. Now, a lot of people think that it's left to right. It's not. In fact, it's top to bottom. Your heart contracts the atria, which are the two upper chambers, contracts those first, and then you contract the two lower chambers, which are the ventricles. And in between all of those, there are one-way valves to keep the blood moving forward. We don't want it flowing backwards in the heart. That can cause a lot of issues here. So you have a couple different types of blood vessels. Your arteries carry blood away from the heart. Now, the majority of the time they'll be carrying oxygenated blood, but there is one case in which it doesn't, and that's your pulmonary artery. Then you have smaller and smaller arteries as they go out further from the heart. So they start decreasing in size once you get to that systemic circulation. So you've got the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body, and it leaves the heart, and then things continue to branch and get smaller and smaller until you hit arterioles, which is the smallest type of artery that connects into a capillary bed. Your capillaries are single-celled networks of vessels. Part of it is arterial, part of it is venous, or venous, excuse me, and it allows for the exchange of material across it via simple diffusion. Once you get past those capillaries, you get into venules, which are the tiny, thin-walled vessels that empty up into larger veins because it does the exact opposite. They get bigger and bigger and bigger by combining back together until they come into the heart via one of two major blood vessels. You have your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava. So your oxygen and nutrients can easily pass into the capillaries. Your waste easily transports out of the cells into those capillaries, and again, by simple diffusion. So there's just a difference in the concentration of each product, which causes them to move across that membrane. Blood itself, there's a couple of different components to blood. You've got red blood cells, which are responsible for transporting oxygen to the cells and then transporting waste materials away from the cells up to the lungs for exhalation. You have white blood cells, which are primarily responsible for fighting infection. You have platelets, which are little pieces of cells that are meant to form clots to prevent bleeding. And then you have plasma, which is the majority of the blood. It's the liquid component of the blood in which everything floats around in, and it also has a bunch of things dissolved in it, but mostly it's water. A blood clot has several different factors that cause it to form, and you have to have several different steps in order for that to happen. Changes in your blood vessels around the wound itself, they tend to constrict right around the wound to bring the edges closer together and to slow down blood flow to that particular area. The rest of the body around it tends to dilate to try and get more factors there quickly. It's got to stop the blood itself. And then it actually has to form a stronger clot so that it doesn't keep getting blown out. So when you've got an injury to a blood vessel, then you have fibers in there that your body usually doesn't recognize because they're covered up, but now all of a sudden they're exposed. And so that activates your platelets to get very, very sticky. And then they start sticking together and they start sticking to the edges of that wound. Then you have red blood cells that become sticky and start adding to that. So it forms a minor clot. This is one of those things where your blood stops, but if you were to touch that cut, it starts bleeding all over again. It's not very strong. So then you've got different proteins that are floating around in your blood that are activated and come to that site, and they add some reinforcement. It's like putting biological rebar down in order to actually form a strong clot. And you guys know that that forms after a little while, and a lot of us pick at it. But that's what is formed at the end. Your autonomic nervous system we talked about as well. This is all of the automatic functions within the body. We don't control the majority of them. We can have influence, but we don't control them. So it monitors the body's needs from moment to moment. It always has an eye on what's going on. It adjusts blood flow by constricting or dilating different blood vessels. It automatically redirects blood away from other organs to those main necessary vital organs if need be. And then it adapts to changing conditions in the body in order to maintain homeostasis and perfusion. If the system fails to provide that sufficient circulation, then we have what's called shock. So some pathophysiology and perfusion. Perfusion is that circulation of blood within an organ or tissue so that you can actually meet the cell's metabolic needs. You can give them enough oxygen and you're removing enough waste so that they don't have issues. Your speed of blood flow must be fast enough in order to maintain adequate circulation throughout the body, and it has to go fast enough so that it doesn't become stagnant or stay in one place within the blood vessels, because then it will start to clot. But it must be slow enough to allow those cells time to exchange the oxygen and nutrients for that carbon dioxide and other waste products. Some of your tissues need a constant supply of blood, and others can survive on a relatively small amount of blood. But all organs need perfusion in order to function properly. So they do have to get blood. If you have a specific organ system that can't function without high amounts of oxygen or decent blood flow, and that organ system starts to fail, typically it's a cascading effect. One starts to fail and another one tries to compensate, but it can't quite keep up, so it starts to fail, and then so on and so forth until you ultimately have death of the person. Hemorrhage is just a fancy medical term for bleeding. With serious external bleeding, you can really have a hard time estimating how much blood has been lost. Blood looks very different on different surfaces if it's absorbed in clothing or diluted in water, but we still want to try and estimate the amount of blood loss that our patient has suffered. Um, and truthfully, a lot of times we over guesstimate. It looks like it's a lot more than what it really is. And that's okay. It's better to overestimate than to underestimate for sure. Um, your body doesn't tolerate blood loss of greater than 20% of your blood volume. So that's about 2 pints because the typical male has approximately 70 milliliters of blood per kilogram of body weight, and a female has about 65 milliliters of blood per kilogram of body weight. When you start having significant blood loss, you're going to have at first an increase in heart rate, an increase in respiratory rate, and then you start seeing a decrease in blood pressure. Your heart is going to try and compensate for that low blood pressure by speeding up how quickly your blood is circulating around. Your body is going to increase your respiratory rate because what blood you do have, it wants to make sure that it's fully saturated with oxygen. And so you start breathing a little bit faster, but eventually your body cannot keep up. It can't compensate anymore. And so then you're going to start seeing a decrease in blood pressure. Like we've talked in lab, there are ways to tell that somebody's in shock well before their blood pressure starts to fall. And that's certainly where we want to catch it. So, how well people compensate definitely depends on how much they're bleeding and how rapidly they're bleeding. An regular adult can comfortably donate 500 milliliters of blood over a 15 to 20-minute period, and they do just fine. If that same blood loss occurs in a much shorter period of time, then the person may end up developing symptoms of hypovolemic shock. The age, pre-existing health conditions definitely are considered. Blood loss is an extremely serious problem and demands immediate attention. Sometimes you do end up considering massive bleeding before you mess with airway and breathing. A lot of times we still want to make sure our patient has an airway, but if you have serious arterial bleeding, generally there's going to be two of you. So divide and conquer. There's two different types of bleeding that we see as far as external bleeding. So there's arterial bleeding, which causes blood to spurt, makes bleeding very difficult to control. It's typically a lot brighter red because it's rich in oxygen, and it tends to spurt in time with the pulse, and it decreases the overall amount of blood circulating in the body, and so this causes a greater drop in blood pressure. Venous bleeding is dark red because it's lower in oxygen. It flows slowly for the most part compared to arterial. It kind of depends on the size of the vein. It doesn't spurt, it's much easier to manage, but it can be profuse and life-threatening. So don't think venous bleeding is not life-threatening because it certainly can be, but it is more likely to clot spontaneously than arterial blood will. The last type of bleeding is capillary bleeding. So this is bleeding from those really small capillary blood vessels. Typically not super bad. I mean, in the whole likelihood of it, it's dark red. It oozes from the wound steadily, but pretty slowly. And it's more likely to clot also than arterial blood because of the lower pressure. And we will talk some more about this in the next video.